my name's Helen Paynter. I'm Biblical Studies Tutor at Bristol Baptist College. It's been my privilege and delight to be involved in Bible Month this year and to put together some thoughts about the book of Isaiah to help you as you engage with this amazing book. Although my specialism really is narratives in the Old Testament, I just love Isaiah so much. It's a book that is brimming over with hope, with joy, with surprises, with beautiful poetry, tenderness of God, and of course a book that echoes through the rest of Scripture. That's some of the reasons why I really love it. Let me try and talk you through a little bit to help orientate you to what we're going to be doing with Isaiah in Bible Month this year. I guess, first of all, it's just a bit of background. You probably know that the idea of a prophet as being exclusively somebody who sees into the future is perhaps not the easiest or best way to look at what prophecy was. Prophets in the Old Testament, they were kind of political commentators almost as much as anything else. A lot of the time they are looking at the times that they are living in and writing to. And they're saying, you see what's going on here? Let me point this out to you and explain why this is happening and what's God's perspective on what's going on. Now, as part of that, they certainly do look into the future, and we'll touch on that in a few minutes with Isaiah. But let's not expect Isaiah to be continuously looking into the future and anticipating the coming of Messiah. He's doing a lot more than that. Let's talk a little bit about who Isaiah was. We know a very little bit about Isaiah ben Amos, Isaiah the son of Amos, who probably wrote at least the first part of this book. We read about his calling towards the beginning of the book. He has this extraordinary vision, the year that King Uzziah died. The year that King Uzziah died was a year of great turmoil because Uzziah had been king for a long time and there had been a sense of stability under his reign. But actually in the year that he dies, things are starting to kick off internationally. Things are starting to feel very threatening. And this is his moment when he sees this transcendent vision of God and gets this calling from God. Don't know if you remember the way in which that calling is expressed. Let me just turn to it quickly. Jesus refers to it, of course, and quotes it himself. Let me just find it a second. Go and say to this people, God says to Isaiah, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull, and their eyes heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see and turn and be healed. There's a kind of sarcasm, a kind of satire there, but something actually about the hardness of the prophetic calling comes through here. Prophets, certainly leading up to the exile, they kind of never had good news. And as a result, they weren't welcomed. They weren't welcomed to the nation. They weren't welcomed in the court. Life was really hard. If you had that call. And I think we get this sense with Isaiah and other prophets in the Old Testament that call was heavy upon them. And I think they'd have chosen another way, another life, if they could have done. But that sense of God's commission weighing upon them and their inability to deny it, I suppose. We're not told in Scripture what happens to Isaiah, but tradition has it that he was persecuted for his message and that he ended up being sawn in half, possibly something to do with him hiding in a tree. We don't know for sure which of those are just kind of fables and which of those are historical traditions. But that's probably who the writer to Hebrews has in mind. He speaks about people being sawn in half in Hebrews 11, the great heroes of faith, and he's probably thinking of Isaiah at that point. Now, if you know much about Isaiah at all, you may well know that there is dispute about whether Isaiah ben Amos wrote the whole book or not. You see, at the beginning, it feels like, well, this prophet is clearly, explicitly speaking into the nation that has not yet fallen to the Babylonians. By the end, the people have gone into exile, and the prophet is speaking about their return, and is speaking about King Cyrus, who is many generations later. And this divides scholarship, divides many Christians. Some people make it a kind of, a creedal belief that Isaiah ben Amos wrote the whole thing and was given divine foresight. Other people say, well, I don't think that's what's going on. I think we've got 2, maybe even 3 writers here whose work has been compiled together into a single volume. Personally, I don't care. I'm perfectly content in my own mind that God is able to give that divine foresight to anybody. Whether he did or not here, whether that's what's going on here, I'm not persuaded, actually. I tend to think that there's more than one voice here that we're encountering. But I don't mind, because what we need to do is read each part of the book of Isaiah into the context in which it is speaking, whether that's before the exile, during the exile, or after the exile. Read it in that context, when it was spoken, when it was written in relation to that time. I don't think it's too critical. Now, one of the wonderful things about the book of Isaiah is the way that it echoes through the remainder of Scripture. It picks up many other themes in the Old Testament and echoes and reflects those. As you're reading through, look in particular for the story of Exodus, and often linked with that, creation narratives. Look for language that reminds you of creation, reminds you of Exodus, especially when Isaiah speaks about God doing a new thing. But Isaiah is used hugely in the New Testament. And we've got this big book in our library at college here, and it's called Commentary on the New Testament's Use of the Old Testament. And I had a quick look just a few minutes ago to see how many references there were to the book of Isaiah in the New Testament. And I looked at the list and I thought, well, I'm not counting that lot. But what I did do is I skimmed through, and every single chapter of Isaiah has an entry in this book. In other words, the writers of this book think that every single chapter in Isaiah is somewhere reflected in the New Testament, and some of them many, many times. Let me give you one example that you may not have heard. It's a kind of obscure little bit of information that inspires and thrills me and might inspire and thrill you. Isaiah 6, we've spoken about it already. This is the call of Isaiah. And he says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. Okay, high and lifted up. And he has this vision of God in the throne room of heaven. Isaiah 52, at the beginning of the suffering servant song, Isaiah says this, behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up. Okay, so exactly the same language is being used. We've got this vision of God in glory, high and lifted up, and the suffering servant, high and lifted up. But they're completely different parts of the book. Okay, now the writer of the 4th gospel notices this and uses this to bring these 2 texts together. So in John 12, we read these words. When Jesus had done these things, he departed and hid himself from them. Though he'd done so many signs before them, they still didn't believe in him, so that the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Now listen to the quotations he uses. Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? That is the suffering servant song, Isaiah 52 and 53. John goes on, therefore they could not believe. For again, Isaiah said, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Now, the writer is quoting Isaiah 6. So he's brought Isaiah 52:3 and Isaiah 6 together, probably because he's noticed this language which is repeated. And then he goes on to say this. Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. So the writer of the 4th gospel sees that this servant, this suffering servant, marred beyond all recognition, and this elevated God in the throne room of heaven are in some way speaking of the same individual, and brings it together to show us that, and uses the language of glory. What does the glory of God look like? Look at the suffering servant, says the 4th gospel. That's just one example of the way that Isaiah is used, and some of his richness is drawn out in the New Testament. Now, I haven't got very long. I just want to highlight a few themes from the book of Isaiah. Let me just point you to a couple of things that we don't really deal with in Bible Month because we don't have time, but they're so, you so don't want to miss them. The language of gospel, euangelion in the Greek, we first really encounter this in Isaiah 40. Now, obviously, Isaiah is written in Hebrew in the first instance, but then it's translated into Greek. And when it's translated into Greek, we get this word, gospel, coming in. So Isaiah 40, verse 6. Verse 9. Get you up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good news, herald of good news, herald of the gospel. Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of the gospel. Lift it up, fear not. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Here is this idea of a herald who gets up on a high mountain to proclaim gospel, to proclaim good news. And I think when the gospel writers are starting to try and find ways of expressing the amazing thing that's happened in Jesus Christ, they go back to Isaiah and they say, look, remember Isaiah spoke of a herald climbing a mountain and proclaiming good news? That's what's been going on in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's the language we'll use. So there's one thing to notice. 45 and 46, chapters 45 and 46, some of my favorites, where we get this language of God being the only God. I am God and there is no other. We see it again and again. And then that's in 45. And then 46, we see this language of the God who bears his people's burdens. And Isaiah uses the image of one of the pagan gods who has to be carried. He has to be put on a beast of burden, or he burdens down his people as they carry him from place to place. That's what the Babylonians had to do when they celebrated their festivals. They brought the gods out of their temples. They carried them around for their kind of parades and so on, and then they carried them back to the temples. Isaiah says, our God bears his people's burdens. Beautiful, beautiful use of contemporary ideas and inverting them to say something wonderful about the true God. And let me show you about the themes we will be covering. I suppose I should say that what I'm not doing is breaking the book up by, first we look at chapters 1 to 20, and then we look at chapters 21 to 25 or whatever, because the themes run through and weave through, and I felt it was better to take a thematic approach rather than a kind of a sectional approach. So the first week we're going to look at tough love. We're going to look at some of the beautiful, tender ways that the love of God is expressed in Isaiah. But we're also going to look at some of those really challenging passages where God speaks really strong words of judgment to his people through the prophet. And we're going to ask the question of, are these incompatible? Are they, is Isaiah kind of, expressing almost two gods, a good God and a bad God, a happy God and an angry God sort of thing. We're going to explore those ideas. And spoiler alert, I argue that a God of judgment is absolutely what we want, and that it's the flip side of a God of love. You can't have the one without, you could have judgment without love, but you can't have true love without judgment. That's what I'll argue, but hopefully you'll see some of that and be persuaded by some of that as you read through my notes, but of course, most importantly, the scriptures that week. The second week, we're going to look at the theme of light to the nations, the theme of God's blessing, God's love, God's purposes being far bigger than Israel itself. Now, this is, again, not unique to Isaiah. We see it many places in the Old Testament, and then this is picked up and resounds loudly and clearly in the New. But one of the places in the Old Testament where it is most clearly expressed is in Isaiah. And I'm going to pull out some familiar and maybe some less familiar passages to explore that with you. The third week, we'll look at messianic prophecy. We'll look at what Isaiah is glimpsing and setting out about the promised one, the anointed one that God in Isaiah's future is going to send. We'll look at the way that Isaiah understands the Messiah's mission, and we'll think a bit about how that tracks into the New Testament and how Jesus fulfills those prophecies. And then the final week, we're going to look at some of the eschatological vision that Isaiah has. In other words, his vision of a new heavens and a new earth, which are a place of peace, a place of justice, a place where there is no violence, a beautiful new world, which we're still waiting for. But Isaiah glimpses so clearly and gives us a beautiful vision of in his book. That's a very quick overview of some of the things we're going to be looking at. I so love this book. And I have to say that having just been turning again to that passage in Isaiah 40, which I read to you earlier, the one about going up in the mountain and proclaiming good news, I have got the sound, the track, or the part of Handel's Messiah going around in my head, because Handel set this to music, and I can hear it in my head as I speak. So my recommendation, if you want a soundtrack to Bible Month this year, you could do worse than turn to Handel's Messiah. It's not all based on Isaiah, but he uses Isaiah very richly, sometimes quite creatively, but beautifully, to meditate on the mission, the life, the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that would be my recommended soundtrack. May God bless you as you engage with this wonderful book in his wonderful word this year.